The dusty streets of Copper Ridge fell silent as the stranger dismounted his midnight stallion outside Sullivan's general store. His spurs clinked against the wooden boardwalk, each step deliberate and measured. When he reached into his coat and produced 3 gleaming gold coins to pay for supplies that cost mere pennies, every eye in town turned toward him. But it was what happened next that would change everything. Sarah McKinnon, the shopkeeper's daughter, bit down on one of those coins to test its authenticity. The metal pierced like flesh, crimson drops staining her lips. In that moment she realized the mysterious stranger who had ridden into their town was not entirely human. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1887 brought drought to the Colorado Territory. Like a curse from an angry god, wells ran dry, cattle died where they stood, and decent folk packed their belongings for greener pastures back east. Copper Ridge, once a thriving mining town nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, had dwindled to barely 300 souls, clinging to hope and stubbornness in equal measure. Sarah McKinnon swept the dust from her father's general store for the 3rd time that morning, watching it resettle on the shelves like fine snow. At 24, she had grown accustomed to the endless cycle of cleaning and restocking that filled her days since her mother's death 5 years prior. Her father, Thomas McKinnon, spent most afternoons on the porch nursing a bottle of whiskey and staring at the empty mines that had once made him wealthy. The store itself reflected the town's decline. Shelves that had once overflowed with goods from Denver and beyond now held meager supplies, salt pork, flour, ammunition, and little else. The ornate cash register her father had imported from Chicago sat silent most days, its brass fittings tarnished from neglect. Sarah kept the books, and she knew what the numbers meant. Without a miracle, they would be forced to close by winter. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah arranged the few remaining bolts of fabric in the front window, hoping to catch the eye of any passing traveler. The heat pressed down on the town like a physical weight, and even the flies seemed too exhausted to buzz with their usual enthusiasm. Main Street stretched empty before her, nothing but dust devils and the occasional tumble of dried sage. The church bell chimed 11 when she heard it, the rhythmic thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Sarah looked up from her ledger to see a lone rider cresting the hill at the town's edge. Even at a distance, something about the figure commanded attention. He sat his horse with an easy confidence that spoke of long miles traveled and dangers faced without flinching. As the stranger drew closer, Sarah found herself drawn to the window for a better view. His mount was magnificent, a black stallion that moved with fluid grace despite the rough terrain. The rider himself was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing that seemed untouched by the dust that coated everything else in Copper Ridge. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his features, but Sarah could see the sharp line of his jaw and the casual way he held the reins, as if the spirited horse beneath him was nothing more than a gentle mare. Word of the stranger's approach spread quickly through the small town. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the boarding house, shading her eyes with one hand. Sheriff Garrett stepped out of his office, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. Even old Pete, who ran the saloon, paused in sweeping his front steps to watch the newcomers approach. The stranger reined in his stallion directly, in front of McKinnon's general store. Sarah heard the leather creak as he dismounted, the soft jingle of spurs against the boardwalk. The horse snorted and tossed its head, but stood perfectly still without being tied, as if it understood some unspoken command. The man who pushed through the store's front door was unlike anyone Sarah had ever seen in Copper Ridge. He stood well, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that seemed to fill the small space. His clothing was well made but practical, a black wool coat despite the heat, dark trousers and boots that had seen hard use but remained in excellent condition. What struck Sarah most were his eyes, pale grey like winter ice, set in a face that was both handsome and somehow ageless. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place, perhaps southern, but with something else underneath. "I'm looking for supplies, trail provisions, ammunition, and perhaps directions to the nearest ranch, looking for hands." Sarah found herself momentarily speechless, a reaction that annoyed her considerably. She prided herself on being practical and level-headed, qualities that had kept her father's business afloat when his grief threatened to sink it entirely. Yet something about this stranger left her feeling off balance, as if the very air in the store had changed with his presence. "We have some supplies," she managed, gesturing toward the sparse shelves. "Though I should warn you, our selection isn't what it used to be. Times have been hard." The stranger's gaze swept the store, taking in the empty spaces where goods should have been, the carefully arranged items that couldn't quite hide their scarcity. When his eyes returned to Sarah, she thought she saw something like sympathy in their pale depths. "Hard times often bring unexpected opportunities," he said. "I find that fortune has a way of changing when folks least expect it." There was something in the way he spoke, a quiet confidence that suggested he had seen such changes firsthand. Sarah found herself wanting to believe him, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was simply that hope had become such a rare commodity in Copper Ridge. "What kind of supplies do you need?" She asked, moving behind the counter where her father's old ledger lay open. "Jerky, hardtack, coffee if you have it. 2 boxes of 44 cartridges. Oats for my horse." He paused, studying her face. "And perhaps you could recommend a good blacksmith. My stallion threw a shoe somewhere outside of Trinidad." Sarah began gathering the requested items, her mind calculating the total cost. It would be more than most travelers spent, certainly more than the store had seen in a single transaction for months. As she worked, she became aware that the stranger was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not in a way that felt threatening, but as if he was studying something particularly interesting. "The blacksmith's shop is 2 blocks down," she said, wrapping the jerky in brown paper. "Marcus Webb runs it, though I should warn you he's not the most reliable. Sometimes he's there, sometimes he's at Peterson's saloon." "And the ranches?" the stranger asked. "Any hiring seasonal hands?" Sarah hesitated. The question was reasonable enough, but something about the way he asked it seemed important, as if her answer might determine more than just his employment prospects. "The Double Bar Ranch is about 10 miles north," she said finally. "Jack Morrison owns it. He's been struggling with the drought like everyone else, but he's got the largest spread in the territory. If anyone's hiring, it would be him." The stranger nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "And the town? How long has it been declining?" The personal nature of the question should have offended Sarah, but instead she found herself answering honestly. Since the silver played out about 3 years ago, most of the miners moved on to other strikes. The businesses that depended on them started failing one by one. Now there's talk of the railroad bypassing us, entirely for the new route through Denver. Yet you've stayed. It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "This is my home. My father built this store when Copper Ridge was just a mining camp. My mother is buried in the cemetery behind the church. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds aren't good." For the first time the stranger smiled. It transformed his austere features, making him appear younger and somehow more approachable. "I understand that sentiment better than you might think, Miss McKinnon. Sarah McKinnon. Miss McKinnon, I'm Cole Ashworth." He extended his hand, and when Sarah shook it, she was surprised by the warmth of his skin, given his pale complexion. And the cool way he carried himself, she had expected his touch to be cold. That'll be $4.60, Sarah said, tallying the supplies on a scrap of paper. Cole Ashworth reached into his coat without hesitation. When his hand emerged, it held 3 gold coins that caught the afternoon light streaming through the store's windows. Sarah had seen gold pieces before, certainly, but these were different. They seemed to glow with an inner light, and the craftsmanship was extraordinary. The designs pressed into their surfaces were intricate beyond anything produced by the U.S. Mint, featuring symbols and patterns that seemed almost foreign. "Keep the change," Ashworth said, placing the coins on the counter. Sarah stared at the gold pieces, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. 3 coins of that size and apparent purity would be worth far more than the few dollars of supplies he had purchased. It was the kind of generosity that suggested either extraordinary wealth or complete indifference to money. Neither seemed to fit with a drifter looking for ranch work. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's far too much." "Consider it an investment," Ashworth replied, "in the town's future prosperity." The words were casual, but something in his tone suggested deeper meaning. Sarah picked up one of the coins, intending to examine it more closely. The metal felt warm against her palm, almost alive. The designs etched into its surface seemed to shift slightly in the changing light, creating an optical illusion that made her slightly dizzy. "I should test it," she said, more to herself than to him, "to make sure it's genuine." It was a reasonable precaution in a territory where fool's gold and clever counterfeits could ruin an honest merchant. Sarah had seen her father test suspicious coins dozens of times, biting down on the soft metal to check for the telltale marks that proved authenticity. She raised the coin to her mouth, aware that Ashworth had gone very still behind the counter. His pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pause for just a moment. Then, telling herself she was being foolish, Sarah bit down on the gold piece. The metal yielded to her teeth like flesh. A warm, metallic taste flooded her mouth, accompanied by something else, something organic and distinctly unsettling. When she pulled the coin away from her lips, crimson drops fell onto the counter between them. Sarah stared at the blood on her lips in the store's mirror, then at the coin in her hand. Where her teeth had pressed against the gold, dark red liquid seeped from tiny puncture wounds in the metal. The coin was bleeding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cole Ashworth watched her reaction with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been relief. "You had to test it," he said quietly. "I wondered if you would." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. Gold didn't bleed. Metal didn't have blood vessels or the capacity to feel pain. Yet the evidence was literally in her hands, warm and undeniably real. "What are you?" she whispered, setting the coin down carefully on the counter. "Someone who has been searching for this town for a very long time," Ashworth replied, "and someone who has found exactly what he was looking for." Through the store's front window, Sarah could see Ashworth's black stallion waiting patiently in the street. The animal's eyes, she realized with a growing sense of unreality, were the same pale grey as its master's. As she watched, the horse turned its head toward the store, as if it could sense the conversation taking place inside. "The ranch work," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not really looking for employment." "No," Ashworth confirmed, "though I am interested in the Double Bar Ranch, and in this town, and particularly in you, Miss McKinnon." The way he said her name sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Not threatening, but loaded with implications she couldn't begin to understand. The 3 gold coins lay on the counter between them, the wounded one still seeping crimson drops that pooled like tiny rubies on the worn wood. "I don't understand any of this," Sarah said, taking a step backward. "Understanding will come," Ashworth assured her, But it will require trust and perhaps more courage than you think you possess. Your town is dying, Miss McKinnon. Your father's store is failing. The railroad will bypass Copper Ridge, and within 2 years, this place will be nothing but a ghost town with tumbleweeds blowing through empty buildings. Each word hit Sarah like a physical blow because she knew he was speaking the truth. She had seen the same inevitable decline in dozens of other mining towns throughout Colorado Territory. When the resources played out and the economy collapsed, people moved on to the next opportunity. Buildings were abandoned, businesses closed, and eventually nature reclaimed what man had built. Unless, Ashworth continued, circumstances change. Unless someone with the right resources and knowledge chooses to invest in Copper Ridge's future. Someone like you. Perhaps, but such investments require certain considerations in return. Sarah's practical mind began to work despite her fear and confusion. What kind of considerations? Partnership, trust, and access to certain information about this area that only long-time residents would possess. What information? Ashworth moved closer to the counter, his presence somehow both magnetic and unsettling. There are maps in your father's possession, Miss McKinnon. Surveys from the original mining claims. Records of where the silver veins were discovered and where they led before the operations were abandoned. Information about underground chambers and passages that were sealed when the mines closed. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her father did indeed possess such documents, stored in an old trunk in their home's attic. Maps and papers from his early days as one of Copper Ridge's founding investors, when silver discoveries had seemed limitless and the future had stretched bright with possibility. But how could Ashworth know about them? I've never seen any maps. She lied. Ashworth's smile returned, but this time it held no warmth. I can hear the deception in your voice, Miss McKinnon, just as I can smell the fear beneath your brave facade. But I'm not your enemy. Quite the opposite, in fact. Then what are you? Someone who understands that Copper Ridge sits on more than abandoned silver mines. Someone who knows that certain veins of ore were sealed, not because they played out, but because the miners found things down there that they couldn't explain. Things that scared them enough to abandon profitable claims and spread stories about cave-ins and gas pockets. The store's afternoon light seemed to dim as Ashworth spoke, though no clouds had passed over the sun. Sarah felt as if she were standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down into depths she had never imagined existed. My father never mentioned anything like that, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she remembered whispered conversations between her parents that had stopped whenever she entered the room. Late-night discussions about the mines that her mother had seemed to find deeply troubling. Thomas McKinnon was one of the few men who went down into the deeper shafts, Ashworth said. He saw what the others saw, and he made the decision to keep certain discoveries secret rather than pursue them further, a wise choice given his family's safety. But times change, Miss McKinnon, and sometimes secrets can no longer remain buried. Outside the store, Sarah heard the approach of footsteps on the boardwalk. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Garrett walking purposefully toward McKinnon's general store, his hand resting on his gun belt. Behind him came Marcus Webb, the blacksmith, and Dr. Harrison from the medical practice. Word of the strangers. Presence had clearly spread, and the town's leading citizens were coming to investigate. It seems your neighbors are concerned about my presence, Ashworth observed, without turning around. Small towns tend to be suspicious of outsiders, especially those who display unusual wealth. They're good people, Sarah said quickly. They're just being cautious. Of course, and their caution is warranted, though perhaps not for the reasons they imagine. The store's front door opened with its familiar chime, and Sheriff Garrett stepped inside. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with greying hair and eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize it when it walked into his. A town. His gaze moved immediately to the gold coins on the counter, then to Sarah's pale face. "Miss McKinnon," Garrett said politely. "Is everything all right here?" "Fine, Sheriff," Sarah managed, though her voice sounded strained even to her. "O'Neill's." Garrett's attention shifted to Cole Ashworth, taking in the stranger's expensive clothing and confident bearing. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure, Mr. Sheriff Dan Garrett. And you are—" "Cole Ashworth," the stranger replied, extending his hand. "Just passing through, looking for supplies and possibly some work." Garrett shook the offered hand, but Sarah noticed his expression change slightly, as if something about Ashworth's grip had surprised him. "What kind of work?" "Ranch hand, mining consultation, whatever's available. I have experience with livestock and underground operations." "Mining consultant," Garrett repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting, considering most folks around here consider the mining business finished." "Often the best opportunities are found in places others have given up on," Ashworth replied smoothly. Dr. Harrison and Marcus Webb entered the store, followed by several other curious townspeople. The small space quickly became crowded, but Sarah noticed that everyone maintained a respectful distance from Ashworth, as if some invisible barrier surrounded him. "Those are some impressive gold pieces," Dr. Harrison observed, gesturing toward the counter. "Don't see many of that quality in these parts." "Family heirloom," Ashworth said without hesitation. "My grandfather had them made by a private mint back east." Sarah wanted to point out that one of the coins was still bleeding onto her father's counter, but the words wouldn't come. She realized with a growing alarm that everyone else in the store seemed to see only ordinary gold pieces. The blood, the supernatural wounds her teeth had created, were apparently visible only to her. "Well, Mr. Ashworth," Sheriff Garrett said, "I hope you find what you're looking for. Just remember that Copper Ridge is a peaceful town, and we intend to keep it that way." "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your peace, Sheriff. In fact, I believe my presence here might prove beneficial to everyone concerned." As the townspeople began to disperse, each taking one last curious look at the well-dressed stranger, Ashworth leaned across the counter toward Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Tomorrow evening, after sunset, ride north toward the Double Bar Ranch. When you reach the old mine entrance about halfway there, stop and wait. Come alone and bring your father's maps. It's time you learned the truth about what lies beneath Copper Ridge. And if I refuse," Ashworth's pale eyes held hers for a long moment, "then this town will die as surely as winter follows autumn. The choice, Miss McKinnon, is entirely yours." With that, he gathered his supplies and walked toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he turned back one final time. "The coins are yours to keep regardless of your decision. Consider them a gesture of good faith." Sarah watched through the window as Cole Ashworth mounted his black stallion and rode slowly down Main Street. Several townspeople emerged from their businesses to watch his departure, but none approached him. There was something about the stranger that kept people at a distance, some quality that suggested approaching him uninvited would be unwise. When the last sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, Sarah looked down at the 3 gold coins on her counter. 2 gleamed normally in the afternoon light, but the third continued to seep crimson drops onto the wood. As she watched, the bleeding gradually slowed and stopped, leaving only tiny puncture marks where her teeth had pressed. Against the metal, she picked up the wounded coin with trembling fingers. It felt warm and somehow alive, pulsing with an energy that made her skin tingle. Whatever Cole Ashworth was, whatever he wanted from her and her town, Sarah realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Outside, Copper Ridge continued its slow decline toward the grave, unaware that salvation might have just ridden into town on a midnight stallion. But salvation, Sarah was beginning to understand, often came with a price that the desperate might not fully comprehend until it was too late to refuse. Sarah McKinnon spent that evening staring at the 3 gold coins spread across her kitchen table, unable to eat the simple supper of beans and cornbread she had prepared. The wounded coin had stopped bleeding hours ago, but the tiny puncture marks remained visible like scars on otherwise perfect metal. Every few minutes she would reach out to touch it, half convinced she had imagined the entire supernatural encounter. Her father sat across from her, nursing his 3rd glass of whiskey since returning from his afternoon vigil on the store's front porch. Thomas McKinnon had aged considerably since her mother's death, his once powerful frame now gaunt, his thick brown hair gone grey and thinning. The successful businessman who had helped establish Copper Ridge had gradually retreated into a bottle, leaving Sarah to manage both the store and their dwindling finances. "Strangest thing happened today," Sarah began carefully, watching her father's reaction. "A man came to the store, paid for supplies with gold coins like these." Thomas glanced at the coins with bloodshot eyes, then returned his attention to his whiskey. "Travelers pass through sometimes, nothing strange about that." He knew about the old mining maps you keep in the attic. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Thomas McKinnon's head snapped up, his watery eyes suddenly sharp and focused. The glass trembled in his hand, sloshing amber liquid onto the worn tablecloth. "What did you tell him?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Nothing. I said I'd never seen any maps." Sarah leaned forward, studying her father's frightened expression. "But he knew, Papa. He knew you had surveyed the deeper shafts. Before they were sealed, he mentioned underground chambers and passages." Thomas set down his glass with such force that whiskey splashed across the table. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and began pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "You can't trust him, Sarah. Whatever he told you, whatever he promised, you can't believe a word of it." His hands shook as he ran them through his thinning hair. "Some things are better left buried. Some doors should never be opened." "What doors, Papa? What happened in those mines?" Thomas stopped pacing and fixed his daughter with a look of such anguish that Sarah felt her heart clench. In that moment, he looked every one of his 58 years, weighted down by secrets that had clearly been eating at him for decades. "We found things down there, Sarah. Things that didn't belong in any mine shaft, chambers that had been carved by hands that weren't human, symbols on the walls that hurt to look at for too long." He sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. The silver was real enough, but it was just the surface layer. Underneath there were passages that went deeper than any of us dared to follow. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of passages? Old ones. Older than the mountains. Themselves, maybe. The air down there was different, thicker somehow. And there were sounds echoing up from the depths. Not cave-ins or settling stone, but something else. Something that sounded almost like voices. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant howl of wind through the eaves. Sarah processed her father's words, trying to reconcile them with the rational world she thought she understood. "The other investors," she said finally, "they agreed to seal the passages?" Thomas nodded grimly. "We took a vote, sealed everything below the 3rd level with dynamite and concrete, told everyone the veins had played out and the mines were too dangerous to continue working. Most of the men were relieved. Whatever was down there, it was starting to affect people. How? Nightmares at first. Dreams about walking through corridors that couldn't exist, hearing voices calling from the darkness. Some of the miners started sleepwalking, trying to return to the sealed sections. 3 men quit and left town without collecting their final pay, rather than go back underground. Sarah remembered her mother's worried expressions during those final mining years, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever she entered the room. "Mama knew?" Elizabeth was the one who convinced me to vote for sealing the passages. She said some discoveries weren't worth the cost they demanded. Thomas reached across the table and grasped Sarah's hand. Promise me you won't go looking for those maps. Promise me you'll stay away from that stranger, whatever he calls himself. His name is Cole Ashworth. He wants to meet tomorrow night at the old mine entrance. He says the town will die if I don't cooperate. Thomas McKinnon's face went white as bone. Ashworth, dear God, it's really him. You know that name? I know what it represents. Thomas stood again, this time moving with purpose toward the old wooden cabinet where he kept his hunting rifle. Elizabeth warned me this day might come. She said if anyone ever came asking about the sealed passages using that particular name, I should take you and leave Copper Ridge immediately. Sarah watched in growing alarm as her father checked the rifle's action and began loading cartridges into the chamber. Papa, you're scaring me. What did Mama know about Cole Ashworth? She grew up in these mountains, Sarah. Her grandmother was Ute, and the Ute people have stories about the deep places beneath the earth, stories about things that lived here long before humans arrived. Thomas set the loaded rifle against the wall within easy reach. Elizabeth said her grandmother called them the Old Ones, beings that existed in spaces between the world we know and realms we can't imagine. That's just folklore, Papa, tribal legends, is it? Thomas gestured toward the gold coins on the table. You said that a stranger paid with those. Look at them again, Sarah. Really look at them. Sarah picked up the wounded coin, examining it more closely in the lamplight. The craftsmanship was indeed extraordinary, far beyond anything produced by contemporary mints. The symbols pressed into its surface were unlike any currency she had ever seen, featuring geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. More disturbing, the puncture marks from her teeth had begun to close, the metal somehow healing itself. The Ute stories say the Old Ones sometimes walk among humans, Thomas continued. They appear in times of great change when communities face extinction or transformation. They offer salvation, but the price is always higher than it first appears. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying I believe it, what would such a being want with our little town? However, Ashworth continued, with proper investment and development, Copper Ridge could become one of the most prosperous communities in the territory. New mining operations, expanded railroad connections, businesses and settlers drawn by opportunity. Your father's store could become the foundation of a commercial empire, in exchange for reopening the sealed passages. Among other considerations, yes. Thomas stepped protectively closer to his daughter. Sarah, don't listen to him. Whatever he's promising, the cost will be higher than you can imagine. The cost, Ashworth said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality, is simply cooperation. Help me access the deep chambers, and I will ensure Copper Ridge's prosperity for generations to come. Refuse, and watch your town die as surely as winter kills summer flowers. Sarah looked at her father's frightened face, then at Cole Ashworth's confident expression. The choice seemed impossible. Trust a being of unknown nature and intentions, or watch everything she had ever known slowly crumble into dust. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, but not too much time. Tomorrow night, as we discussed, bring the maps, Miss McKinnon. Bring them, and step into a future beyond your current imagination. With that, Cole Ashworth walked toward the front door. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back at Sarah with those disturbing pale eyes. One final thought to consider. The passages beneath Copper Ridge were not sealed to keep something out, Miss McKinnon. They were sealed to keep something in, and that something has been waiting a very long time for someone to set it free. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah and her father alone with the implications of his words. Outside, they heard the sound of hoofbeats as Ashworth rode away into the night, but Sarah noticed something troubling. The rhythm was wrong for a horse carrying a rider. Instead of the expected 4-beat pattern, she heard only 3, as if the creature moving through the darkness had somehow lost one of its legs, or as if it had never possessed 4 legs to begin. With Sarah spent the following morning in a state of restless anxiety, unable to concentrate on the store's routine tasks. Every customer who entered seemed to carry whispers about the mysterious stranger who had ridden through town, and she found herself scrutinizing each face for signs of the supernatural influence that Cole Ashworth had demonstrated so effortlessly. The 3 gold coins remained locked in the store's safe, but Sarah could feel their presence like a physical weight. Twice during the morning, she had opened the heavy door just to verify that the wounded coin was still healing itself, watching in fascination and horror as the puncture marks continued to fade. Dr. Benjamin Harrison was the first to voice what others were clearly thinking. The town's physician had arrived at the store shortly after opening, ostensibly to purchase laudanum for his medical practice, but his real purpose became clear when he lingered after completing his transaction. "Miss McKinnon," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "I couldn't help but notice yesterday that you seemed rather unsettled after that stranger's visit. I hope he didn't cause you any distress." Sarah appreciated the doctor's concern, but she also recognized the fishing expedition beneath his polite inquiry. Benjamin Harrison had served as Copper Ridge's physician for 12 years, and his medical training made him naturally observant of human behavior. If anyone in town might notice the supernatural elements surrounding Cole Ashworth, it would be him. "He was perfectly polite," Sarah replied carefully. "Just a traveler looking for supplies and work." "Indeed. Though I must say, his payment method was rather extravagant for someone seeking employment. Gold coins of that quality suggest considerable wealth. Perhaps he's had good fortune in previous positions." Dr. Harrison nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "You know, Miss McKinnon, I've treated many patients over the years who claimed to have witnessed unusual phenomena. Most, I'm afraid, were suffering from various forms of nervous exhaustion or the effects of excessive alcohol consumption. However, a few cases have given me pause." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of cases?" "Individuals who described encounters with beings that seemed human, but exhibited characteristics that defied medical explanation. Unnaturally pale skin that showed no signs of blood circulation, body temperatures that remained constant regardless of environmental conditions, reflexes and strength that exceeded normal human parameters." The description matched Sarah's observations of Cole Ashworth with disturbing accuracy. His skin had indeed been remarkably pale, and when she had shaken his hand, his flesh had felt warm, despite his apparent coldness of manner. More troubling, she recalled how effortlessly he had heated the rifle barrel to the point where her father couldn't hold it. "These patients," she said carefully, "what happened to them?" "Most recovered completely after removing themselves from the source of their distress. Distance, it seemed, provided protection from whatever had affected them. However, those who chose to maintain contact with the unusual beings—" Dr. Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, let's simply say their outcomes were less favorable." Before Sarah could pursue this line of questioning further, the store's front door opened to admit Marcus Webb, the town's blacksmith. Webb was a massive man, thick through the chest and shoulders from years of working over his forge, with graying hair and hands that were permanently stained with coal dust. His expression was troubled as he approached the counter. "Miss McKinnon, I need to speak with you about that stranger who came through yesterday. Something's not right about him." Sarah exchanged glances with Dr. Harrison, who showed no signs of leaving despite the arrival of another customer. "What do you mean, Mr. Webb? He came to my shop late yesterday afternoon, like you said he might, wanted me to shoe his horse." Webb removed his cap and ran his fingers through his hair. But when I went to examine the animal, I found something that doesn't make sense. What kind of something? The horse was wearing shoes already, Miss McKinnon, brand new ones, perfectly fitted, made from metal I've never seen before. Dark as iron, but with a sheen like silver, and harder than anything. In my experience, when I told him the animal didn't need my services, he just smiled and rode away. Dr. Harrison leaned forward with interest. You're certain about the condition of the shoes, Doctor? I've been shoeing horses for 23 years. I know the difference between worn shoes that need replacing and fresh ones that were fitted. Recently, that animal's hooves were in perfect condition and the metalwork was superior to anything I could produce. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Cole Ashworth had specifically mentioned needing a blacksmith when he visited the store, using the request as part of his cover story for being in Copper Ridge. If his horse had never actually needed shoes, then his entire visit had been planned in advance, including his knowledge of where to find her. There's something else, Webb continued, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone in the store. When I approached the animal to examine its hooves, it looked at me directly. Not the way horses usually look at strangers, but like it was studying me, evaluating me, and its eyes, he shuddered visibly. They were the same color as its riders, pale gray like winter ice. The implications of Webb's observations were deeply unsettling. Sarah had assumed that Cole Ashworth was some form of supernatural being who happened to own an unusual horse. But if the animal shared its master's unnatural characteristics, then their partnership might be something far more significant than simple companionship. Has anyone else in town mentioned unusual encounters? Dr. Harrison asked, his scientific curiosity clearly aroused, despite his obvious concern. Sheriff Garrett stopped by the forge this morning, Webb replied. Said he's been having trouble, sleeping since yesterday, dreams about riding through tunnels that go deeper than any mine shaft, hearing voices calling from the darkness below. He wanted to know if I'd experienced anything similar. Sarah's heart sank. If the sheriff was already being affected by Ashworth's presence, then the supernatural influence was spreading beyond direct contact. She remembered her father's description of the miners who had worked the deep passages, how exposure to whatever lay beneath Copper Ridge had given them nightmares and compelled them to attempt unauthorized returns to the sealed sections. Dr. Harrison, she said urgently, the patients you mentioned who had encounters with unusual beings. What were their symptoms? Initially, vivid dreams featuring impossible architecture and voices speaking in unknown languages. As the condition progressed, they reported seeing glimpses of these dream environments during waking hours. Eventually, some began attempting to physically locate the places they had seen in sleep, and the less favorable outcomes you mentioned. Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave. 3 patients, over the course of my career, simply vanished. No signs of violence, no indication of where they might have gone. They left their homes in the middle of the night and were never seen again. In each case, family members reported that the missing individual had become obsessed with finding underground passages or hidden chambers. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Cole Ashworth's presence was already beginning to affect the town's residents, starting with those who had encountered him directly and spreading to others through some mechanism Sarah didn't understand. If the influence continued to grow, Copper Ridge might face something far worse than economic decline. I need to speak with Sheriff Garrett, Sarah said, making a decision that surprised her with its suddenness. Mr. Webb, Dr. Harrison, I'm going to tell you something that may sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah shared everything she had learned about Cole Ashworth, from the bleeding gold coin to her father's revelations about the sealed mine passages. She described the maps hidden in their attic, the symbols that hurt to look at directly, and Ashworth's demand for access to the deep chambers beneath Copper Ridge. Both men listened without interruption, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern to genuine alarm as Sarah's story unfolded. When she finished, Webb was the first to respond. "Miss McKinnon, under normal circumstances, I'd suggest you speak with Dr. Harrison about nervous exhaustion. But given what I saw yesterday, and considering the sheriff's reaction," he shook his head slowly. "I've lived in these mountains my entire life. My grandfather was one of the original prospectors who established Copper Ridge. He used to tell stories about things that lived in the deep places, creatures that were here before humans arrived. Folklore and legends," Dr. Harrison said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. "Surely there must be a rational explanation." "Doctor," Sarah said quietly, "would you like to see the gold coin that bled when I bit it?" 20 minutes later, Dr. Harrison sat in stunned silence at the store's counter, staring at the wounded coin through his magnifying glass. The puncture marks were nearly healed, but traces of dried blood remained visible in the metal surface. As a man of science, he had tried to find logical explanations for what he was seeing, but the evidence defied every principle of physics and chemistry he understood. "The blood appears to be human," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Type O, if my field testing is accurate. But the metal shows no signs of having been artificially treated or modified. It's genuine gold, of exceptional purity, which means Cole Ashworth is what he appears to be," Sarah concluded. "Something that looks human, but possesses characteristics that medical science can't explain." Before anyone could respond, the store's front door burst open to admit Sheriff Dan Garrett, his face flushed with exertion and his hand resting on his revolver. Behind him came 3 other men Sarah recognized as members of the town council: Judge William Hawthorne, banker Edmund Pierce, and merchant Robert Chen, whose family had immigrated from California during the gold rush years. "Miss McKinnon," Garrett said urgently, "we need to talk, all of us. Something's happening in this town, and it started with that stranger's visit yesterday." The group gathered around the store's central table, where Sarah spread out a map of Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. As the men described their experiences since Ashworth's arrival, a disturbing pattern emerged. Judge Hawthorne had spent the night reviewing old territorial law books, searching for legal precedents regarding mineral rights and underground access, though he couldn't explain why the subject had suddenly seemed so important. Banker Pierce had found himself calculating the potential profits from reopening the abandoned mines, despite having no background in mining operations. Merchant Chen had experienced dreams about vast underground chambers filled with treasures beyond imagination. "It's as if he planted suggestions in our minds," Pierce said, mopping perspiration from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Ideas that feel like our own thoughts but pursue agendas we would never normally consider." "Mass hysteria," Dr. Harrison suggested weakly, though his conviction was clearly wavering. "Shared delusions brought on by stress and economic uncertainty." "Doctor," Judge Hawthorne said gravely, "I've presided over this territory's courts for 15 years. I know the difference between hysteria and genuine supernatural influence. What we're experiencing exceeds the boundaries of rational explanation." Sheriff Garrett leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Miss McKinnon, your father mentioned that this Ashworth character wants to meet with you tonight. I'm thinking maybe we should be there when that happens. With respect, Sheriff, I don't think conventional law enforcement would be effective against someone like Cole Ashworth. He demonstrated abilities yesterday that suggest normal weapons won't harm him." "Then what do you propose?" Sarah looked at the faces around the table, seeing fear mixed with determination in the eyes of men who had helped build Copper Ridge from wilderness into civilization. They were asking her to lead them against a threat none of them fully understood, using methods that hadn't been tested against supernatural adversaries. "My mother's grandmother was Ute," she said slowly. "According to my father, she had knowledge. About the old ones who live in the deep places, there might be traditional protections or rituals that could help us." "Your father would know more about this than anyone," Dr. Harrison pointed out. "Perhaps we should consult with him." "Papa's terrified of Cole Ashworth. He wants us to pack up and leave Copper Ridge immediately, but running away won't solve the problem. If Ashworth can influence people from a distance, he'll simply follow us wherever we go, and if we leave the sealed passages undefended, he'll have free access to whatever lies beneath the town." Marcus Webb spoke up from his position near the window, where he had been watching the street for signs of the mysterious stranger. "Miss McKinnon, what exactly do you think is down there? In those deep chambers your father's people sealed off?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Based on everything she had learned, Cole Ashworth was not acting alone. His references to partnerships and mutual benefits suggested he was working toward goals that extended beyond simple access to underground passages. The healing gold coin indicated abilities that transcended normal human limitations, and his horse's unnatural characteristics implied a connection to powers that operated by rules different from those governing the mortal world. "I think," she said finally, "that the chambers contain something that wants to return to our world, something that's been trapped beneath Copper Ridge for decades, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and abilities to break the seals and open the pathways." "Something like what?" "I don't know. But my mother's grandmother called them the Old Ones, beings that existed here before humans arrived. If they were powerful enough that the Ute people remembered them in stories past, down through generations, and if they inspired the miners to risk their investments by sealing profitable passages, then they represent a threat we can't afford to ignore." Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat. "Miss McKinnon, speaking from a legal perspective, we have very limited options. We can't arrest a man for paying with unusual currency or making cryptic statements. We have no evidence of actual crimes being committed, and even if we did, I suspect normal judicial procedures would prove inadequate against someone of Ashworth's apparent nature." "Which brings us back to the question of traditional protections," Dr. Harrison said. "If medical science offers no solutions, perhaps we should explore alternatives that our rational minds would normally reject." Sarah made her decision. "I'm going to that meeting tonight. But I'm not going alone, and I'm not going unprepared. Sheriff, can you gather whatever men you trust? Absolutely. We'll need people who won't panic when faced with supernatural phenomena." "How many men?" "Enough to secure the mine entrance and prevent escape, but not so many that we can't move quietly. 6 or 8 at most." Banker Pierce looked alarmed. "Miss McKinnon, surely you don't intend to confront this Ashworth directly. If he possesses the abilities you've described, such an encounter could prove fatal. If we don't confront him tonight, he'll proceed with opening the sealed passages. And if the stories about what lies beneath Copper Ridge are true, that could prove fatal for everyone in the territory." Sarah folded the map with decisive movements. "I'd rather face a known threat than wait for an unknown one to be unleashed." As the men filed out of the store to make their preparations, Sarah remained behind to wrestle with the implications of her decision. She was about to lead a group of ordinary townspeople against a supernatural adversary whose capabilities remained largely unknown. The rational part of her mind insisted that such a plan bordered on suicidal foolishness. Yet the alternative was to allow Cole Ashworth unrestricted access to whatever had been sealed beneath the mountains around Copper Ridge. And if her father's fears and her mother's inherited knowledge were accurate, that alternative might prove far more catastrophic than any risk posed by direct confrontation. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah began gathering the items she thought might prove useful against an enemy who operated by rules that transcended human understanding. Salt, which folklore claimed could create barriers against supernatural entities. Iron objects, including her father's old cavalry sword from his service in the territorial militia. And most importantly, a small leather pouch that had belonged to her mother, containing herbs and stones that Elizabeth McKinnon had described as protective charms passed down through her Ute bloodline. Whether any of these precautions would prove effective against Cole Ashworth remained to be seen. But as darkness gathered over Copper Ridge, Sarah realized that she was about to discover just how much truth lay hidden beneath the legends her mother's people had preserved through generations of careful remembrance. The confrontation that would determine Copper Ridge's fate was only hours away. As twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Sarah made her final preparations for the confrontation that would determine Copper Ridge's fate. Her father had locked himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey and his old service revolver, muttering prayers in a mixture of English and what Sarah suspected were Ute phrases her mother had taught him years ago. The protective items she had gathered lay spread across her bedroom dresser like talismans against an approaching storm. Salt formed neat lines in small leather pouches. Iron objects gleamed dully in the lamplight. Her father's cavalry sword, horseshoe nails from Marcus Webb's forge, and a collection of railroad spikes she had purchased from the defunct Colorado and Southern Depot. The small medicine bundle that had belonged to her mother felt warm against her palm, as if the herbs and stones within recognized the approaching danger. Sheriff Garrett arrived at sunset with 5 men whose faces reflected the grim determination of soldiers preparing for battle. Besides the sheriff himself, the group included Deputy Marshal Jake Coleman, a lean man in his 30s who had served with distinction during the territorial Indian Wars. Marcus Webb brought his massive frame and steady temperament, along with several iron tools from his blacksmith shop. Dr. Harrison carried his medical bag alongside a shotgun that looked oddly out of place in his scholarly hands. Judge Hawthorne had surprised everyone by insisting on joining the expedition, despite his 60-year-old frame and complete lack of combat experience. The final member was Miguel Santos, a former cavalry scout whose knowledge of the mountain terrain was unmatched in the territory. "Miss McKinnon," Sheriff Garrett said quietly, "I want to be clear about something before we head out. Once we leave town, there's no turning back. If this Ashworth is what you say he is, and if the things under the mountain are real, then some of us might not return from tonight's work." Sarah looked at each man's face, seeing fear tempered by resolve in their weathered features. These were frontier men who had faced hardship, violence, and death throughout their lives, but they were preparing to confront something beyond their experience or understanding. "I know the risks, Sheriff. We all do. But if we don't act tonight, everyone in Copper Ridge faces consequences we can't predict or control." She secured the medicine bundle inside her coat. "My mother's people have stories about fighting the old ones. They say courage matters more than weapons, and unity matters more than individual strength." Deputy Coleman checked his rifle action one final time. "Ma'am, what exactly are we expecting to find out there? I mean, should we be prepared for gunfights or something else entirely?" "Something else entirely," Sarah replied honestly. "Cole Ashworth demonstrated abilities that suggest conventional weapons won't harm him, but he's also trying to achieve a specific goal, which means he might be vulnerable when he's focused on opening the sealed passages." Miguel Santos, who had remained silent during the preparations, finally spoke in his softly accented English. "Miss McKinnon, my grandmother, was Apache. She told stories about the times before, when spirits walked the earth in bodies that looked human, but were not. She said such beings could be defeated, but only by those who understood the old ways. What old ways? Binding them to their purpose, making them choose between what they want and what they are. Sometimes the choice tears them apart. The cryptic advice resonated with something Sarah had read in her mother's journals years ago, though she couldn't recall the specific details. Perhaps understanding would come when the moment demanded it. The group left Copper Ridge as full darkness settled over the territory, following the winding mountain trail toward the abandoned mine entrance. Sarah rode her father's old gelding, a steady animal that had served the family well for over a decade. The men were mounted on horses borrowed from the town's small livery stable, animals chosen for reliability rather than speed. The night air carried an unusual stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. No coyotes howled. In the distance, no owls called from the pine trees, and even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth and the soft creaking of leather saddles. They reached the halfway point, to the Double Bar Ranch, without incident, though Sarah noticed that their horses were becoming increasingly nervous as they approached the old mine entrance. Her gelding's ears swiveled constantly, and he shied at shadows that posed no visible threat. Marcus Webb's mare actually tried to turn around and head back toward town, requiring firm handling to keep her moving forward. The animals sensed something, Dr. Harrison observed, his scientific mind cataloging even supernatural phenomena. Their behavior suggests the presence of a predator, though I see no evidence of wolves or mountain lions. They sense wrongness, Miguel Santos corrected quietly. Horses know when the natural order has been disturbed. They feel things humans miss. The abandoned mine entrance appeared ahead of them as a dark wound in the mountainside, framed by the skeletal remains of mining equipment that had been left to rust when the operations ceased. Wooden support beams stood like the ribs of some massive creature, and the opening itself seemed to swallow the starlight without reflection. Sarah dismounted and approached the entrance cautiously, her hand resting on the medicine bundle beneath her coat. The sealed passages lay several hundred feet below ground level, accessible through a main shaft that descended at a gentle angle before branching into the network of tunnels her father's maps had detailed. "He's already here," she announced, pointing to tracks in the soft earth. "Horse prints, but they're wrong somehow." Sheriff Garrett crouched beside the tracks, studying them by lantern light. "These prints show only 3 hooves," he said slowly, "like the animal is missing a leg, or it never had 4 legs to begin with," Deputy Coleman finished grimly. The implications sent a chill through the group. If Cole Ashworth's mount was as unnatural as its master, then they were facing adversaries who operated by rules that defied understanding. As they prepared to enter the mine, Sarah distributed the protective items she had brought. Salt went into everyone's pockets, with instructions to create circles if they needed sanctuary. Iron objects were distributed according to each man's preferences and abilities. She kept the medicine bundle for herself, along with her father's. "Cavalry sword. Remember," she told the group, "we're not here to fight unless absolutely necessary. Our goal is to prevent Ashworth from opening the sealed passages. If we can delay him until sunrise, he might lose whatever power allows him to work in darkness." The assumption about daylight was pure speculation, but Sarah needed to give her companions some reason for hope. Leading them into supernatural danger without any plan for survival would be both cruel and pointless. They entered the mine in single file, their lanterns creating pools of yellow light that seemed woefully inadequate against the pressing darkness. The main tunnel sloped downward at a steady angle, its walls lined with timber supports that groaned ominously as they passed. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying strange scents that had nothing to do with mineral deposits or stagnant water. 20 minutes of careful descent brought them to the first branch point, where smaller tunnels diverged toward the abandoned mining claims. According to the maps Sarah had studied, the sealed passages lay another 100 feet deeper, accessible through the main shaft that continued downward toward the mountain's heart. It was here that they encountered the first signs of recent activity. The tunnel floor showed clear evidence that heavy equipment had been moved through the passage, though how such machinery could have been transported to this location without anyone in Copper Ridge noticing remained a mystery. Deep grooves in the earth suggested that massive objects had been dragged toward the deeper levels. "Miss McKinnon," Dr. Harrison whispered, "I'm detecting chemical odors that suggest explosive charges have been detonated recently. Substantial amounts, based on the residual traces." The news confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Cole Ashworth had not waited for their meeting to begin his work. While the town slept, he had somehow moved mining equipment into the abandoned tunnels and started the process of clearing the sealed passages. The confrontation she had planned might already be too late to prevent disaster. They pressed deeper into the mountain. Following the evidence of excavation activity, the tunnel walls began to show scorch marks from blasting operations, and piles of rubble indicated that significant barriers had been removed. Most disturbing, the wooden support. Beams in this section appeared to have been reinforced with metal struts that gleamed like silver in the lantern light. "Those supports," Marcus Webb observed, "they're made from the same material as the horseshoes I saw yesterday, harder than iron, but with that strange silvery sheen, which suggests Ashworth has access to resources that don't exist in our world." Judge Hawthorne added grimly, "The implications for territorial law are staggering, assuming we survive to address them." They reached the sealed section sooner than Sarah had expected. According to her father's maps, the barriers should have been located another 50 feet deeper into the mountain. Instead, they found themselves standing before a massive opening where solid rock and concrete should have blocked further progress. The demolition work was extraordinary in its precision. Rather than the crude blasting Sarah had anticipated, the barriers had been removed with surgical accuracy, leaving clean edges that showed no signs of explosive damage. The tunnel beyond stretched into darkness that seemed to actively resist their lantern light, as if illumination itself was unwelcome in the deeper regions. More unsettling was the temperature change. While the upper tunnels had grown steadily, cooler as they descended, the air flowing from the newly opened passage was noticeably warm, carrying scents that reminded Sarah of exotic spices and unfamiliar vegetation. "There's a light source ahead," Deputy Coleman reported, pointing into the passage, "flickering like firelight, but the color is wrong." Sarah strained her eyes and confirmed his observation. Deep in the tunnel, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, an amber glow painted the walls with shifting patterns. The light pulsed rhythmically, like the breathing of some massive creature. "That's where we'll find him," she said with certainty she didn't feel. "And whatever he's trying to release." The group advanced into the passage with weapons ready, though Sarah suspected their conventional armaments would prove useless against what they were about to encounter. The tunnel walls in this section showed clear signs of artificial construction, but the architecture was unlike anything associated with mining operations. Smooth curves replaced angular supports, and the stone itself seemed to flow like water. Frozen in mid-motion, symbols began appearing on the walls, carved deep into the rock and filled with what appeared to be metal that glowed with its own inner light. The designs hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made Sarah's eyes water and her head ache. She recognized some of the patterns from her father's maps, but seeing them carved full size into living rock was far more disturbing than studying small drawings on paper. "Miss McKinnon," Miguel Santos called softly, "the tracks change here. They're not horse prints anymore." Sarah looked down and saw that the scout was correct. The hoof prints that had followed them from the mine entrance had transformed into something else entirely, Long scratches in the stone floor suggested claws rather than hooves, and the spacing indicated a creature that moved with a gait unlike any earthly animal. "He's changing," she realized. "The deeper we go, the less human he becomes." As if summoned by her words, Cole Ashworth's voice echoed from the depths ahead, carrying impossible distances through the winding passage. "Miss McKinnon, how thoughtful of you to bring friends, though I fear they are poorly equipped for what awaits in the chamber ahead." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the stone itself rather than traveling through air. Sarah felt the sound in her bones, a vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. "You're too late, Ashworth," she called back, hoping her voice carried the confidence she didn't feel. "The town knows what you are. If we don't return, others will come." Laughter answered her, rich and musical and utterly inhuman. "My dear Miss McKinnon, once the final seal is broken, it won't matter how many people know my nature. The old ones do not fear human knowledge or human weapons. They are beyond such concerns." The amber glow ahead grew brighter as they advanced, and Sarah began to make out the source of the illumination. The passage opened into a vast chamber whose dimensions defied the mountain's external geography. The space was far too large to exist within the peak they had entered, suggesting that the tunnels led to realms governed by different physical laws. At the chamber's center stood Cole Ashworth, though his appearance had changed dramatically since their encounter in Copper Ridge. He was taller now, perhaps 8 feet in height, and his human features had become more angular and predatory. His pale grey eyes glowed with their own light, and when he smiled at their approach, Sarah saw teeth that were definitely not human. Behind Ashworth, carved into the chamber's far wall, was a circular doorway sealed with metal plates covered in the same symbols that decorated the tunnel walls. The plates glowed with increasing intensity, and Sarah could see that several had already been removed, leaving gaps in the barrier like missing teeth in a skull. "Welcome to the threshold, Miss McKinnon," Ashworth said, his voice now carrying harmonic overtones that seemed to vibrate inside Sarah's skull. "You arrived just in time to witness the completion of a work that began before your ancestors learned to walk upright." "What's behind that door?" Sarah demanded, though part of her already knew the answer would be something her mind was not equipped to comprehend. "Home," Ashworth replied simply. "A realm that has been sealed from this world for far too long, but not for much longer." As he spoke, the remaining metal plates began to crack, glowing with heat that turned the chamber air into shimmering waves. Something was pushing against the barrier from the other side, something that possessed power enough to weaken seals that had held for generations. Sarah realized with growing horror that they had arrived not to prevent Cole Ashworth from opening the doorway, but to witness the final moments before something far more dangerous than him emerged into their world. The real confrontation was about to begin. The metal plates sealing the ancient doorway cracked with sounds like thunder, sending vibrations through the chamber floor that made Sarah's teeth rattle. Cole Ashworth stood before the failing barrier, his transformed features illuminated by the increasingly intense glow emanating from behind the sealed portal. His pale grey eyes reflected the amber light like mirrors, and when he raised his arms toward the cracking seals, Sarah could see that his fingers had elongated into something resembling claws. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Garrett whispered, raising his rifle despite the futility of the gesture, "I believe we're about to see something that will change our understanding of the world permanently." The first seal plate fell with a crash that echoed through the impossibly vast chamber. Where it had been mounted, a gap now revealed swirling darkness shot through with veins of light that moved like living things. The air pressure in the chamber shifted dramatically, and Sarah felt her ears pop as if she were ascending to a great height. Through the gap came sounds that had no earthly equivalent, a rhythmic thrumming like a massive heartbeat, whispers in languages that predated human speech. And underneath it all, the unmistakable sensation of vast intelligence stirring after eons of forced slumber. "Miss McKinnon," Dr. Harrison said, his voice tight with scientific fascination and mounting terror, "the atmospheric readings in this chamber are impossible. The oxygen content is increasing beyond normal levels, and the temperature is rising, despite our depth underground. Whatever lies beyond that barrier exists in an environment completely unlike our world." Sarah gripped her father's cavalry sword, knowing it would prove useless against the forces they were witnessing, but taking comfort from its familiar weight. The medicine bundle beneath her coat had grown noticeably warm, and she could smell the sharp scent of sage and sweetgrass as the protective herbs reacted to the supernatural energies filling the chamber. A second seal plate cracked down the center, the metal screaming as it bent outward under pressure from the other side. The gap widened, and through it Sarah caught glimpses of movement that made her mind struggle to process what she was seeing. Shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than her eyes could register, flowing between forms like liquid shadow. Given substance and will, how many seals remain? Deputy Coleman asked, his voice barely audible over the increasing noise from beyond the portal. Sarah counted quickly. 4 plates are still intact, but they're all showing stress fractures. Minutes, maybe less. Cole Ashworth turned toward them, his transformation continuing as the portal weakened. His human clothing had vanished, replaced by what appeared to be armor, made from the same silvery metal as the horseshoes Marcus Webb had observed. Most disturbing, wings were emerging from his shoulders, not feathered like a bird's, but leathery and veined like those of some enormous bat. "You should feel honored," he said, his voice now carrying harmonic overtones that seemed to bypass Sarah's ears and speak directly to her mind. "Few humans have witnessed the awakening of the old ones. Fewer still have lived to remember the experience. We're not planning to let you complete this," Sarah replied, though she had no idea how they could possibly prevent what was already in motion. Ashworth's laughter filled the chamber with a sound like breaking glass. "My dear Miss McKinnon, I am not completing anything. I am merely serving as midwife to an event that was always destined to occur. The seals were never meant to be permanent. They were designed to weaken over time, allowing the old ones to return when humanity had developed sufficiently flavor to make their homecoming worthwhile." The implications of his words sent a chill through Sarah's heart. If the seals had been designed to fail, then her father's generation of miners had not stumbled upon ancient protections, but upon a carefully orchestrated delay mechanism. The old ones had planned their return from the moment they had been banished, and everything that had happened since, the establishment of Copper Ridge, the mining operations, even Sarah's own presence in the chamber, had been part of their long strategy. A third seal plate split completely, its pieces falling into the growing aperture with splashes that suggested they were falling into liquid rather than solid ground. The gap was now large enough for Sarah to see more clearly what lay beyond the barrier, and the sight made her stomach lurch with vertigo. Beyond the portal stretched a landscape that violated every principle of physics and geography she understood. Vast spires twisted upward into a sky that shifted between colors that had no names, while below them stretched gardens where crystalline trees bore fruits that pulsed with internal light. Floating islands drifted through the impossible sky, connected by bridges that seemed to be made from solidified music. And moving through this alien paradise were the old ones themselves. They were beautiful and terrible, beyond description, beings of living geometry that constantly shifted between forms while maintaining an essential identity that hurt to contemplate directly. Some resembled enormous insects with wings like stained glass windows. Others flowed like mercury given consciousness and purpose. All of them possessed a presence that spoke of intelligence so vast that human thought was merely the buzzing of insects by comparison. "They're magnificent," Dr. Harrison whispered, his scientific objectivity crumbling before the reality of what he was witnessing, "and completely beyond our ability to comprehend or resist." Miguel Santos suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm, his weathered face pale with recognition. "Miss McKinnon, I know this place. My grandmother described it in the old stories. She called it the first world, the realm that existed before the current creation. According to Apache tradition, it was sealed away when the hero twins established the boundaries between realities. Then the seals can be restored," Sarah said with sudden hope. "If your people's heroes created the original barriers, there must be a way to rebuild them. The hero twins drew their power from the Creator and the natural order of things," Santos replied grimly. "They were aspects of divine will made manifest. We are merely human beings with iron weapons and good intentions." Before Sarah could respond, the fourth seal plate began to buckle outward. The metal glowed cherry red as something on the other side pressed against it with enormous force. Cracks appeared around its edges, spreading like a spider web across the ancient barrier. Cole Ashworth spread his newly manifested wings and rose several feet from the chamber floor, suspended by forces that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. "Behold," he called to them, "the return of Earth's true masters. Your species has had its time as stewards of this world. Now you will learn what it means to serve beings who shaped reality when your sun was merely cosmic dust." The fourth plate shattered completely, and through the enlarged opening came the first of the old ones to set foot in the earthly realm for countless millennia. The being that emerged defied Sarah's ability to focus on it directly. Her eyes insisted. It was a towering humanoid figure, wreathed in flowing robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself. But peripheral vision suggested something entirely different, a geometric construct of impossible angles that folded through dimensions her mind couldn't grasp. When the Old One spoke, its voice resonated through the chamber like the music of the spheres, beautiful and utterly alien. Sarah found herself understanding the words despite never having heard the language before, as if the being's communication bypassed normal hearing and spoke directly to the understanding. "Long have we waited in the spaces between worlds," it said, "watching your species grow from primitive hunter-gatherers to the complex civilization you have built upon our former domain. You have done well as temporary custodians, but your stewardship ends now." Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, his rifle trained on the impossible figure despite the obvious futility of the gesture. "This is sovereign territory of the United States, of America. I order you to return to wherever you came from." The Old One's attention turned toward the sheriff, and Sarah saw Garrett stagger under the weight of that alien regard. When the being smiled, though smiled was inadequate to describe the expression that crossed features that weren't quite features, Garrett's rifle began to dissolve in his hands, its metal components separating into their constituent atoms and drifting away like dust. "Your governmental structures are quaint," the Old One observed, "but irrelevant. We recognize no authority save that of natural law, and natural law decrees that the strong shall inherit dominion from the weak." More Old Ones were emerging through the portal now, each one unique in its impossible geometry but all radiating the same sense of vast ancient intelligence. They spread through the chamber like water flowing into a container, examining their surroundings with the casual interest of landlords inspecting a property after a long absence. Sarah realized that conventional resistance was indeed hopeless. These beings possessed power that transcended human understanding, and they clearly viewed humanity as a minor inconvenience to be dealt with, rather than a genuine threat. If there was any hope of preventing their complete dominion over the earthly realm, it would require strategies that went beyond physical confrontation. The medicine bundle beneath her coat was now burning against her skin, and she could hear her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Some battles cannot be won with weapons, Sarah. They can only be won with understanding and sacrifice. Remembering Miguel Santos's reference to the hero twins, Sarah began to formulate a desperate plan. If the Old Ones drew their power from their connection to the First World, then perhaps severing that connection might weaken them enough to force their return. The portal remained open, creating a bridge between realms that allowed the beings to maintain their full strength in the earthly dimension. "Mr. Santos," she whispered urgently, "the old stories about the hero twins, did they describe how the original seals were created?" The Apache scout's eyes widened as he grasped her thinking. "The stories say they used the 4 sacred directions to bind the portal, anchoring it to the natural order of this world, rather than allowing it to remain connected to the First World." "The 4 directions," Sarah repeated, looking around the chamber. "North, south, east, and west. If we could position ourselves at those points, we would need objects of power from this world to serve as anchors," Santos continued, his voice growing excited despite their desperate circumstances. "Atoms that represent the true nature of earthly reality rather than the alien geometries of the First World." Sarah looked at her companions, seeing understanding dawn in their faces. They each carried items that were fundamentally of the earth, iron tools forged in terrestrial fires, weapons blessed by human hands, objects that represented the long struggle of their species to carve civilization from wilderness. "The iron," Marcus Webb said suddenly, "iron is anathema to otherworldly entities in every folklore tradition I know. If we could create a binding circle using iron objects positioned at the cardinal directions, it might weaken their connection to the First World enough to force them back through the portal," Dr. Harrison finished, his scientific mind grasping the theoretical framework despite its supernatural nature. Cole Ashworth had been listening to their whispered conversation, and his transformed features showed amusement rather than concern. "By all means, attempt your primitive ritual," he said mockingly. "The Old Ones have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations far more advanced than yours. Your iron trinkets and tribal ceremonies pose no threat to beings who shape the laws of reality." But Sarah noticed that several of the Old Ones had turned their attention toward the human group, their impossible forms radiating something that might have been wariness. Perhaps Ashworth's confidence was not shared by his ancient masters. "Positions," she ordered quietly. "Webb, take the northern point. Santos, you have the east. Dr. Harrison, position yourself to the south. Deputy Coleman, you take the west." As the men moved to their assigned positions, Sarah remained in the chamber's center, directly before the portal. She drew her father's cavalry sword, feeling the weight of the steel blade that had been forged in Pennsylvania foundries from iron ore mined in American mountains. The weapon might be useless against the Old Ones' physical forms, but it represented something they couldn't understand or replicate: the determination of a young species that refused to surrender without a fight. "Judge Hawthorne, Sheriff Garrett," she called to the remaining men, "when I give the signal, I need you to create as much noise and confusion as possible. Draw their attention while we attempt the binding." The Old Ones were spreading throughout the chamber now, their forms becoming more solid as they established their presence in the earthly realm. Sarah realized they had perhaps moments before the beings became too entrenched to dislodge. She raised her father's sword toward the portal, feeling the medicine bundle's heat spreading through her body like liquid fire. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Copper Ridge, but possibly the future of human civilization itself. The final confrontation was about to begin. Sarah raised her father's cavalry sword above her head, feeling the weight of generations of human determination flowing through the steel blade. Around the chamber's perimeter, her companions had taken their positions at the cardinal points, each clutching iron objects that represented the accumulated knowledge and craftsmanship of their civilization. "Now!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the otherworldly harmonics that filled the air. Marcus Webb drove his blacksmith's hammer against the chamber's northern wall, the iron striking stone with a sound that rang like a bell through the impossible space. The reverberations seemed to cause the nearest old one to waver slightly, its geometric form losing cohesion for a brief moment before reassembling itself. Miguel Santos pressed his cavalry spurs against the eastern wall, the metal points scraping against stone as he began chanting in Apache, calling upon the spirits of the four directions to witness and aid their desperate attempt. His words carried the weight of centuries of tribal wisdom, invoking protections that had guarded his people through countless dangers. Dr. Harrison, positioned at the southern point, held his medical instruments against the wall, scissors, forceps, and scalpels that had saved lives through precise application of human knowledge. Though he understood little of the supernatural forces they were attempting to manipulate, he recognized the scientific principle underlying their approach: the application of terrestrial physics to disrupt alien geometries. Deputy Coleman, at the western position, pressed his rifle's iron barrel against the stone, his finger resting on the trigger in case conventional weapons suddenly became relevant to their struggle. The metal was warm from recent firing, carrying the scent of gunpowder and the memory of countless confrontations between civilization and wilderness. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Lines of blue-white energy began to appear in the chamber air, connecting the four iron objects in a pattern that pulsed with increasing intensity. The old ones reacted with what could only be described as surprise, their impossible forms drawing back from the growing network of earthly power. Cole Ashworth snarled with rage, his transformed features becoming even more monstrous as he realized what the humans were attempting. "Fools! You cannot bind beings who existed before your world was formed. You are insects attempting to cage eagles." But Sarah could see uncertainty in the old one's movements. They were no longer advancing through the chamber with their previous confidence. Instead, they seemed to be testing the boundaries of the energy field that was forming around them, probing for weaknesses in the binding the humans were creating. "It's working," she called to her companions. "Hold your positions. Don't break the connection." The medicine bundle beneath her coat was now burning like a brand against her skin, and she could feel her mother's presence surrounding her like a protective embrace. Elizabeth McKinnon's Ute heritage was flowing through Sarah's consciousness, providing knowledge she had never learned but somehow possessed completely. "The portal," she realized suddenly. "We have to close the portal itself, not just bind the ones who've already emerged." She stepped forward, raising the cavalry sword toward the ancient doorway that still stood open between the worlds. The blade began to glow with the same blue-white energy that connected the cardinal points, and Sarah felt power flowing through her that had nothing to do with her own strength. "In the name of the earth that bore us," she declared, her voice carrying harmonics that matched those of the old ones. "In the name of the iron that shapes our tools, in the name of the blood that flows in human veins, I call upon the natural, order to restore the boundaries between worlds." The old one, who had first emerged through the portal, turned its impossible attention towards Sarah, and she felt the weight of its ancient intelligence pressing against her mind like a physical force. When it spoke, its words carried undertones of amusement mixed with growing concern. "Young mortal, you invoke powers you do not understand. The boundaries between worlds exist at our sufferance, not by natural law. We shaped reality before your species learned to make fire." "Then you should remember," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her courage, "that fire can destroy as well as create. And sometimes the student surpasses the teacher. She drove the sword's point toward the portal's threshold, not attempting to physically damage the opening, but instead using the blade as a focus for the binding energy that was building throughout the chamber. The iron sang as it approached the interdimensional barrier, its terrestrial nature creating dissonance with the alien geometries that held the doorway open. The effect was extraordinary. Where the sword's point touched the portal's edge, cracks began to appear in the otherworldly architecture. The amber glow that had emanated from the first world began to flicker and dim, and the impossible landscape beyond started to waver like a mirage in desert heat. "Impossible," Cole Ashworth gasped, his transformed features showing genuine shock. "The gateway has been stable for eons. Mortal interference cannot affect structures created by beings of our magnitude." But the evidence contradicted his assertions. The portal was indeed weakening, its edges crumbling like sandstone exposed to wind and rain. More significantly, the old ones within the chamber were beginning to fade, their solid forms becoming translucent as their connection to the first world was severed. "The binding is working," Dr. Harrison called from his position, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "The energy patterns are destabilizing their molecular cohesion. They're being forced back to their original dimension." The largest of the old ones, the first to emerge through the portal, made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been a scream of rage. Its geometric form was shifting rapidly now, cycling through configurations that hurt to observe. "Directly, you have won this encounter, mortals," it acknowledged, its voice losing the harmonics that had made it so compelling. "But victory in a single battle does not determine the outcome of a war that spans millennia. We are patient. We will find other doorways, other opportunities to reclaim what was always ours." "Find them somewhere else," Sarah replied firmly. "This threshold is closed to you permanently." She pressed the sword deeper into the portal's structure, feeling the alien architecture collapsing around the iron blade. The first world beyond was retreating, its impossible spires and crystalline gardens fading into darkness as the dimensional barrier reasserted itself. One by one, the old ones were drawn back through the closing portal, their forms dissolving into streams of light that flowed toward the shrinking aperture. They offered no further resistance, apparently accepting that their temporary return to the earthly realm was ending. Cole Ashworth was the last to retreat, his wings folding as his transformed body began to lose its coherence. "This is not finished, Miss McKinnon," he called as the portal's pull began affecting him. "I know your name now, and through it, I will find you again. My name is Sarah Elizabeth McKinnon," she replied proudly, "daughter of Thomas McKinnon and Elizabeth Running Bear McKinnon. I carry the blood of miners and warriors, of pioneers and protectors. When you return, and I know you will, remember that this world has guardians who will not yield." Ashworth's form was already fading as the portal consumed him, but his pale grey eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face until the final moment. Then he was gone, drawn back into the collapsing dimensional gateway along with his ancient masters. The portal itself collapsed with a sound like thunder, the ancient doorway sealing so completely that no trace remained of its existence. Where the elaborate mechanism had stood, only smooth stone remained, as if the barrier had never been breached. The chamber fell silent except for the labored breathing of 6 exhausted humans and the soft dripping of water somewhere in the depths. The impossible architecture that had hurt to look at directly was gone, replaced by ordinary limestone walls that showed clear signs of natural formation. Even the amber glow had vanished, leaving only the flickering light of their lanterns to illuminate the space. "Is it over?" Deputy Coleman asked, his voice echoing strangely in the suddenly normal acoustics of the chamber. Sarah lowered her father's sword, feeling the supernatural energy that had flowed through her, ebbing away like a tide. The medicine bundle beneath her coat was cooling, its protective herbs returning to their natural state. She felt utterly drained, as if the binding ritual had drawn upon reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "It's over," she confirmed, though she suspected Cole Ashworth's final words would prove prophetic. The Old Ones had been forced to retreat, but beings of their apparent power and patience would not abandon their goals simply because of a single defeat. Marcus Webb was the first to move from his position, walking carefully across the chamber to examine the sealed barrier. "Miss McKinnon, the wall here shows no signs of ever having been opened. It's solid limestone, probably laid down millions of years ago." Dr. Harrison joined him, running his hands over the smooth stone surface. "Remarkable. The dimensional portal has been so completely sealed that it's erased its own existence from local reality. From a scientific perspective, this chamber now shows no evidence of supernatural activity, which is probably for the best," Judge Hawthorne observed, holstering the revolver that had proven useless against their otherworldly opponents. "The territorial government would have considerable difficulty processing reports of interdimensional incursions and binding rituals." Miguel Santos gathered the iron spurs he had used in the binding, carefully wrapping them in cloth as if they had become sacred objects. "Miss McKinnon, your mother's medicine was strong. The ancestors of both our peoples smiled upon our work tonight." Sarah nodded gratefully, though she was beginning to realize the full implications of what they had accomplished. They had indeed closed the portal and forced the Old Ones to retreat, but the binding ritual had marked her as someone with knowledge of supernatural forces and the ability to resist them. Cole Ashworth's promise to find her again suggested that other encounters were inevitable. "We need to get back to town," Sheriff Garrett said practically. "The sun will be rising soon, and people will notice if we're all missing." As they prepared to leave the chamber, Sarah took one final look around the space where they had confronted forces beyond human understanding. The ordinary limestone walls and natural acoustics made their supernatural battle seem like a shared hallucination. But she could still feel traces of otherworldly energy in the air. More importantly, she could feel changes within herself. This binding ritual had awakened something in her consciousness, a sensitivity to supernatural forces that she suspected would never fully fade. Her mother's Ute heritage had provided the knowledge needed to close the portal, but that same heritage would likely make her a target for other entities seeking access to the earthly realm. The journey back through the mine tunnels passed without incident, though Sarah noticed that their horses were much calmer than they had been during the descent. Whatever supernatural corruption had affected the underground passages was gone, leaving only the ordinary dangers of abandoned mining operations. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness to find Copper Ridge exactly as they had left it, with no signs that the town had been aware of the cosmic drama playing out beneath the mountains. Lanterns glowed in a few windows where early risers were beginning their daily routines, and the familiar sounds of civilization, roosters crowing, dogs barking, the distant whistle of a freight train, provided reassuring normalcy after their encounter with alien geometries. "What do we tell people?" Deputy Coleman asked as they prepared to part ways. "About what happened down there, I mean." Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth would be impossible for most people to accept, and might actually make the town more vulnerable to future supernatural incursions by drawing unwanted attention from entities like Cole Ashworth. "We tell them the mine tunnels were structurally unsound and posed a danger to anyone attempting to explore them," she decided. "Sheriff Garrett can post warnings about cave-in risks and unsafe air quality. That should keep people away from the area, while protecting them from knowledge they're not equipped to handle." The group agreed to this cover story, though Sarah suspected that each man would carry the memory of their underground battle for the rest of his life. They had seen too much to ever view the world in purely rational terms again, but they had also proven that human courage and determination could prevail against seemingly impossible odds. As the men dispersed to their homes, Sarah made her way back to McKinnon's general store, where she found her father waiting on the front porch with his rifle across his knees. Thomas McKinnon's face showed the relief of a man who had spent the night expecting the worst, but hoping for the best. "Is it finished?" he asked simply. "For now," Sarah replied, settling beside him on the wooden bench where they had sat together. On countless evenings before supernatural forces had intruded into their lives. "The portal is sealed, and the old ones have been forced back to their own realm, but I don't think they'll give up permanently." Thomas nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. "Your mother always said the old powers never really died, just slept, until circumstances allowed them to wake again. She also said that each generation would face its own test, and each would have to choose between courage and surrender." Sarah looked out at the awakening town, watching smoke rise from chimneys as families began their daily routines. Copper Ridge was still dying economically, but it was safe from supernatural predation for the foreseeable future. The choice between allowing the town to decline naturally or accepting Cole Ashworth's dangerous bargain had been resolved in favor of human independence. "What happens now?" she asked her father. "Now we rebuild," Thomas replied firmly, "not just the store or the town, but our understanding of what it means to be guardians of this place. You've inherited responsibilities along with abilities, Sarah. Your mother's people knew that some bloodlines carry obligations as well as gifts. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting Copper Ridge in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah McKinnon began to understand that her life had been permanently changed by the events of the previous night. She was no longer simply a shopkeeper's daughter struggling to maintain her family's business. She had become something new, a protector, standing guard between the human world and the ancient powers that sought to reclaim it. The battle with Cole Ashworth and the Old Ones was over, but the war for humanity's independence had only begun. 3 months after the confrontation beneath Copper Ridge, Sarah McKinnon stood behind the counter of her family's general store, cataloguing shipments that had arrived on the morning train. The Colorado and Southern Railroad had indeed decided to extend their line through the town, bringing with it the promise of renewed prosperity that Cole Ashworth had offered through far more sinister means. The store itself had undergone remarkable changes. Where once the shelves had been sparse and dusty, they now overflowed with goods from Denver, Kansas City, and even as far away as Chicago. Farmers and ranchers from throughout the territory made regular trips to purchase supplies that had previously required journeys of several days to acquire. The cash register that had sat silent for months now rang with steady frequency, recording transactions that gradually restored the McKinnon family's financial stability. But the most significant changes were ones that only Sarah could perceive. Since the night of the binding ritual, she had developed what she had come to think of as supernatural sight, the ability to detect traces of otherworldly influence in objects, places, and people. The 3 gold coins that Cole Ashworth had given her remained locked in the store's safe, but she could feel their alien presence like a constant whisper at the edge of her consciousness. More importantly, she had begun to sense other supernatural presences moving through the territory. Not all of them were malevolent like the Old Ones, but they all represented powers that existed beyond normal human understanding. Some were spirits of the land itself, remnants of the native peoples who had lived in these mountains for countless generations. Others were entities that had been drawn to the Colorado territory by the same mineral wealth that had attracted human settlers. Her father emerged from the store's back room carrying a ledger thick with recent entries. Thomas McKinnon had undergone His own transformation since that night beneath the mountains, the grief and alcohol dependency that had consumed him after his wife's death, had been replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He had begun corresponding with other families throughout the territory who claimed knowledge of supernatural phenomena, slowly building a network of people who understood that the rational world existed alongside forces that defied scientific explanation. "Letter came in on the morning train," he said, handing Sarah an envelope bearing the seal of the territorial governor's office. "Seems word of our mining safety initiative has reached official ears." Sarah opened the letter and read its contents with growing amazement. Governor Frederick Pitkin was commending the town of Copper Ridge for its proactive approach to mine safety, specifically praising the comprehensive sealing of dangerous underground passages that posed risks to public welfare. More significantly, he was authorizing funding for a permanent mining safety office to be established in the town, with Sarah McKinnon appointed as its director. "They want to make me the official mining safety inspector for the entire territory," she said, looking up at her father with surprise. "The salary alone would be enough to completely restore our finances." Thomas smiled with pride. "Your mother always said you were destined for important work. I don't think she could have imagined exactly what form it would take, but she knew you would find your calling." The appointment represented more than financial security. As territorial mining safety inspector, Sarah would have legal authority to investigate unusual phenomena at mining sites throughout Colorado, allowing her to monitor supernatural activity under the cover of official government business. She could prevent other communities from suffering Copper Ridge's near disaster while building a comprehensive understanding of the otherworldly forces that seemed drawn to underground operations. A knock at the store's front door interrupted her contemplation of the government appointment. Through the window, she could see Dr. Benjamin Harrison waiting on the boardwalk, his medical bag in one hand and an expression of concern on his weathered face. "Doctor," Sarah greeted him as she opened the door. "What brings you here this morning?" "Professional consultation," Harrison replied, glancing around the store to ensure they were alone. "I've been treating a patient whose symptoms, well, they remind me of our experiences 3 months ago." Sarah felt her supernatural senses heightening immediately. Since the binding ritual, she had developed an acute sensitivity to anything that might indicate renewed supernatural activity in the territory. "What kind of symptoms?" "Jacob Morrison, who runs the Double Bar Ranch. He came to me yesterday complaining of vivid dreams about underground chambers and voices calling from deep places." "Sound familiar?" The description sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Jacob Morrison's ranch was located directly above the sealed chamber where they had confronted the Old Ones. If supernatural influence was affecting him, it might indicate that their binding ritual had not been as complete as they had hoped. "Has he mentioned any encounters with unusual strangers?" Sarah asked carefully. "Not strangers exactly, but he did mention finding strange tracks on his property, hoofprints that don't match any of his livestock, and that seemed to appear overnight in places where no animals could reasonably travel." Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible before her transformation into the town's unofficial supernatural guardian. "Dr. Harrison, I think we need to pay Mr. Morrison a visit, and we should probably ask Sheriff Garrett to join us." An hour later, a small group assembled at the Double Bar Ranch. Sarah, Dr. Harrison, Sheriff Garrett, and Miguel Santos, who had requested permission to join them after hearing about Morrison's symptoms. The ranch itself appeared normal in every visible respect, but Sarah's enhanced senses detected traces of otherworldly presence that made her skin crawl. Jacob Morrison met them at his front door, and Sarah immediately noticed the signs that Dr. Harrison had described. The rancher's eyes held the same feverish brightness she remembered from her father's description of the affected miners, and his hands trembled slightly, despite his apparent efforts to maintain composure. "Folks," Morrison said, his voice carrying undertones of relief at seeing familiar faces, "I appreciate you coming out. I know my story sounds crazy, but something's been happening here that I can't explain." He led them to his kitchen, where a hand-drawn map lay spread across the table. The crude diagram showed the ranch's property boundaries, with X marks indicating locations where unusual phenomena had been observed. "Started about 2 weeks ago," Morrison explained, pointing to the marks closest to his house. "Found tracks in my pasture that looked like they came from a 3-legged horse, but they appeared in patterns that suggested the animal was moving in perfect geometric shapes rather than following natural grazing paths." Sarah studied the map, noting that the marked locations formed a rough circle around the area where the sealed chamber lay buried beneath the earth. "Have you noticed any other unusual activity? Changes in your livestock's behavior, perhaps?" "My cattle won't graze in the affected areas," Morrison confirmed. "They act like there's something dangerous there, even though I can't see any obvious threats, and my horses have been restless at night, whinnying and pacing like they're trying to warn me about something." Miguel Santos spoke up, his voice grave with concern. "Mr. Morrison, have you been dreaming about underground places? Chambers with symbols carved into the walls?" Morrison's face went pale. "How did you know about that?" "I haven't told anyone about the dreams." "Because we've encountered this pattern before," Sarah said, making a decision to share limited information with the rancher. "Mr. Morrison, your property sits above old mining operations that were sealed for safety reasons. Sometimes those sealed areas can affect people in unusual ways." It was a carefully crafted explanation that contained elements of truth without revealing the full, supernatural reality. Morrison seemed to accept it, nodding with the relief of a man who had found rational explanations for inexplicable experiences. "What can I do about it?" he asked. "The dreams are getting worse, and I'm starting to see things during the day that I know can't be real." Sarah looked at her companions, seeing understanding in their faces. They had dealt with this situation before, and they knew what needed to be done. "We need to reinforce the barriers," she said quietly. "The original ceiling may have been compromised. Somehow, over the next several hours, they conducted what appeared to be a geological survey of Morrison's property, but was actually a supernatural investigation. Using techniques that combined Miguel Santos's traditional knowledge with Sarah's developing abilities, they located the precise spot where otherworldly influence was seeping into the earthly realm. The source was not the original chamber they had sealed, but a smaller fissure that had opened in the rock nearby. The crack was barely visible to normal sight, but Sarah's enhanced perception revealed it as a wound in reality itself, allowing traces of the old one's presence to contaminate the surrounding area. "Secondary breach," Sheriff Garrett observed, grimly, like pressure finding a new outlet after the main valve has been closed. Sarah knelt beside the fissure, feeling the familiar warmth of her mother's medicine bundle responding to supernatural proximity. The repair would require another binding ritual, though on a smaller scale than their previous confrontation. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "we're going to need to conduct some specialized repair work on your property. It involves traditional geological techniques that might seem unusual, but they're necessary to prevent further ground instability." The rancher agreed readily, grateful for any solution to his supernatural afflictions. Over the course of the afternoon, Sarah and her companions performed a modified version of the binding ritual that had closed the major portal. Using iron objects positioned at cardinal directions around the fissure, they created a network of terrestrial energy that gradually sealed the crack in reality. The effect was immediately apparent. Morrison's trembling ceased, His eyes lost their feverish brightness, and the cattle that had been avoiding the area cautiously returned to graze in the affected pasture. More importantly, Sarah's supernatural senses detected the cessation of otherworldly influence flowing through the breach. "That should solve your problem," Dr. Harrison told Morrison as they prepared to leave. "Though if you experience any return of the symptoms, don't hesitate to contact us immediately." As they rode back toward Copper Ridge, Sarah reflected on the implications of what they had discovered. The Old Ones had indeed been forced back to their own realm, but their presence had left lasting damage to the barriers between worlds. Other breaches would likely appear, requiring constant vigilance and intervention to prevent supernatural contamination of the territory. "Miss McKinnon," Sheriff Garrett said thoughtfully, "it seems like this is going to be ongoing work. We can't watch every ranch and mining claim in the territory for signs of supernatural activity, which is why the territorial appointment is so valuable," Sarah replied. "As a mining safety inspector, I'll have reasons to visit sites throughout Colorado. I can investigate unusual phenomena under the cover of official business." Miguel Santos nodded approvingly. "The Apache have a saying, 'One person with knowledge can protect many who lack understanding.' Your mother's gift has made you a guardian for people who don't even know they need protecting." They reached Copper Ridge as evening settled over the mountains, the town's lights creating a warm glow against the darkening sky. The familiar sights and sounds of civilization provided comfort after their encounter with supernatural forces, but Sarah knew that her normal life was permanently changed. She was no longer simply Sarah McKinnon, shopkeeper's daughter. She had become Sarah McKinnon, territorial mining inspector and unofficial guardian against supernatural threats. The knowledge and abilities she had inherited from her mother's Ute bloodline had been awakened by necessity, and they would continue to grow as she faced new challenges. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her room above the general store, Sarah opened a new journal and began recording her experiences with supernatural phenomena. Future guardians would need guidance for dealing with otherworldly threats, and she intended to provide the knowledge that could help them succeed where others had failed. The first entry read, "Day 97 since the sealing. Secondary breach detected and closed at Morrison Ranch. The Old One's influence continues to seek outlets into our world. Constant vigilance required. Iron and earth-based rituals remain effective for small-scale containment." She paused in her writing, listening to the familiar sounds of Copper Ridge settling into another peaceful night. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle announced the arrival of the evening freight, bringing goods and passengers from the outside world. Dogs barked at passing coyotes, and the church bell chimed the hour with reassuring regularity. It was an ordinary frontier town going about its ordinary business, protected by forces its residents would never understand or acknowledge. And Sarah found deep satisfaction in that arrangement. The best protection was often invisible protection, allowing people to live their lives without fear of supernatural predation. As she closed the journal and extinguished her lamp, Sarah reflected on Cole Ashworth's final promise to find her again. She had no doubt that other supernatural entities would test her defenses in the years to come, but she also knew that she was no longer the desperate young woman who had bitten a gold coin and discovered a terrible truth about the world's hidden nature. She was a guardian now, standing watch between the human world and the ancient powers that sought to reclaim it. And she would be ready for whatever emerged from the darkness beyond the stars. The gold coins in the store's safe below pulsed once with their alien energy, as if acknowledging her transformation from victim to protector. Then they fell silent, their otherworldly whispers fading into the peaceful sounds of a Colorado mountain town, settling into dreams that would remain undisturbed by creatures from the spaces between worlds. For now, Copper Ridge was safe, and Sarah McKinnon would make sure it stayed that way. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.